This thing that I thought was nothing because it was just a game that I played ended up being what paid for my master's degree
Gordon
in
Gekko side came out in what he was doing.
everything that I know about economics just from playing this game and doing this kind of experiment stuff. They don't actually care if it's worth money. They want the experience points so that they could level up.
I like to connect the dots. So how did all this actually start to connect and what were you playing at the time?
So the game I was playing is called Eternal Lands. It's very similar to RuneScape, so anybody who's played RuneScape will immediately understand what this game is about. Medieval fantasy themed game where you can choose to be somebody who fights monsters, or you can choose to be somebody who makes weapons and armor and sells that stuff to the people who are fighting monsters. And that's basically what the game is. And what I decided to do in this game was become a producer and make weapons and armor, sell that stuff to the other players. And I didn't realize that it was economics at first, but the deeper I got into the game and the more I explored how the market works, the more I realized that this is what economics really is. And this is something that I can learn from. And then what I decided to do was this is a game. It doesn't really matter what I do because if I screw it up, there's no consequence. I could just quit the game and do something else. And I just decided to keep experimenting. And that was how I basically learned everything that I know about economics just from playing this game and doing this kind of experiment. I actually started this guild with my brother. We had a lot of really obnoxious players that created problems and gave the guild a really bad reputation. And it came down to what do we want to do with this? I ended up kicking my brother out of the guild, but he got over it and we're friends now, so it's fine. And I asked all the people who didn't leave because we were basically pariahs. No one wanted to do anything with us because we had such a bad reputation. And the question was, do we try to change the name of the guild and try to change the way we play to improve our reputation? Or do we just say, we don't care what anyone else thinks and open up a way of playing that nobody else would ever even be able to think of because their first thought is always, what would a good person in the game do? And I turned that around and said, what would a person who doesn't care how they're perceived do in this game? And that made the game a lot more fun, at least to me. I thought it was more fun that way because then I wasn't constrained anymore. So I turned the guild into a business and I thought about how am I going to make this guild make money in a way where they don't actually care what other people think. And I had some experience with the guild that I was in before where they were producing weapons and armor, but since they wanted people to like them, they would not do anything to harm their competitors. They just all wanted to be friends. And I decided no one wants to be friends with us anyway, so why would I do that? Let's just do whatever we want. And I figured out that when you're producing items in the game, the players that are creating this stuff, they don't actually care if it's worth money. They want the experience points so that they could level up. So I just persuaded a bunch of players that they could level up faster by helping my guild produce this stuff. And that way, we didn't care what it costs. We didn't care how much money it would make. It was all about helping these players level up as fast as they possibly could. And that just naturally ended up with a bunch of stuff. And I took that stuff and I dumped it on the market and put a bunch of people out of business. And that's basically the summary of what happened.
You know, what specific principles, market dynamics, competition, player behavior, how do the stuff that you extracted from your intense game playing time, I guess before you became a parent, do you apply those, in your practice to do the stock stuff, do the investment stuff? Like, how do those rules and thought processes impact what you do on a day to day basis outside of gaming?
Can start with how this whole thing got me interested in the business world in the first place. So playing this game and the stuff that I learned in this game and the stuff I did in this game got me interested in studying economics and made me want to be an economics major. And I found economics to be incredibly easy when I started my college classes. And it was around the time I was a sophomore in college, and I was at a Christmas party, and I'll never forget it. And I'm telling my classmates, this is why economics is so easy for me. This is why I always have the highest grade in the class, all those other things. And I was telling them the story, and they just kept telling me, you need to write this down. You need to use this in some way, which was crazy to me because I had actually just thrown away all of my data because it was a game. I just played a game. I didn't really care about it. I didn't care what happened with it or any of that stuff. But it was actually my classmates who persuaded me to write this down in the first place. And I said, okay, if people are insisting that this has some kind of value, then I'm going to take the time to to make sure that it can be valuable for somebody else. So I wrote it down, and then I thought, what am I going to do with this? So I found a professor who didn't know me. He didn't know who I was, and I just thought, I'll get this guy's opinion and he'll be honest with me. And I walked into his office on his office hours, and I just said, I am working on a paper and I need the opinion of an expert, things like that. And since you don't know me, I know you'll be honest. And he said, oh, yeah, sure, I'll help you. And I actually still have it. I still have the thing that I gave him. It was this. And he said, that's insane. he thought I was he thought I was going to give him a 10-page paper, and I gave him this I don't know, half inch, maybe quarter inch notebook. And he said, that's insane. But to his credit, he actually did read it. And when he gave it back to me, he said, never make anyone read this whole thing ever again. So that was my first review of the first draft of my book, was never make anyone read this. But he encouraged me to use one of the chapters as an academic paper. So that's what I did. I took one chapter, which was about the game's design, and I used that chapter as my senior thesis in economics. So I wrote my senior thesis in economics when I was a sophomore, and I did absolutely no work on it because I had done all of that research while I was in high school. And I thought, let's just keep going with this and see where it goes. So I submitted it to a conference, and the response from the people running the conference was that this paper doesn't really have as much math as most economists would want, but they were excited about the idea of using games to make economics more interesting and more exciting and easier to understand. So I had a very nice time slot for my presentation, where most other people had two other presentations happening at the same time. Mine was the only one for that time slot right before lunch, and everybody there got to see what I had to say. And I'm not sure how this happened, but right when I got home, there was an email for me from the graduate department of economics at my university that said, if you want to go to grad school, we'll pay for it. So it was basically this this thing that I thought was nothing because it was just a game that I played, and I just kept going forward with it ended up being what paid for my master's degree in economics. So the things that I think about that directly come from what I learned in this game, there's kind of two sides of it, just really oversimplified and really quick, but it's things that I took from playing this game that I use almost every day. I like to think about where a company fits in its industry and how it competes with other companies. So, for example, do they only care about price? Or is it a combination of the price and the quality of the product they're selling? Is it how good their service is? And then what's the market structure like? Is it just a few very large companies? Is it a monopoly? Is it a lot of very small businesses? And then how big is the industry? I learned about all of that stuff just from experimenting inside this game. The other side of it is thinking about who the customers are and what impact they have on the business. So, for example, are they providing something that the customers can't get anywhere else? Do they have to buy it from this particular business? Or is it easy to replace? Is it something they can easily go somewhere else and buy from somebody else? So it's very basic business concepts like that that are incredibly important in the business world.
You talk about in one point in there reputational capital. So your guild Riva use its market power um, in some ways to, it would be honorable in some ways, but you could push the boundaries if you pushed around other players. You could quote possibly jeopardize some of its sales. So in that exchange where we talked about it briefly before the podcast, you brought up that reputational capital, in your view, hurt companies like Elon Musk Tesla, in that he took a reputational hit. And I guess my question is, can you talk about reputational capital both in the game context you learned of Riva, I guess the guild, and then in the real world? And you don't have to use Tesla as an example of somebody who, paid a price for um, doing things that a large share of its customers might not want. But I'll open the floor to you in terms of what is important about reputational capital, and what did you find out crosses the virtual physical divide, if you will?
Yeah, I can give a little bit of context about where I encountered that in the game, just to draw that bridge. I was part of another guild before I created my own guild, and that guild that I was in was called Riva, and they used a very similar strategy where they just produced a lot of stuff, but they didn't want people to hate them, so they kept prices at basically the market level so that all the other players selling stuff would think they're good, nice, honorable players. And then when I had my guild, which was named Rich, which is just the best name for a villain you could possibly think of, it's such a stereotype. And we didn't really care about reputational capital, where we just cared about money because we called ourselves rich. And that changed the dynamic of the game, where if everything was based on price, the reputation didn't really matter. The buyers would go to whoever was selling for the cheapest. But if they cared about other things like quality and service and all that, reputation would matter a lot more. And if you think about that in the real world, it's kind of a sliding scale. So the more somebody needs the product, the less it matters who sells it, which is why you get companies like Comcast that have a really bad reputation, but people still use it because they have to. So in some cases, it doesn't really matter. And then it's also related to the size of the business. If there's a small restaurant that has a bad reputation, it's probably going to go out of business. But if it's a really big company, they can take a hit to their reputation and but if it's a really big business, they can take a hit to their reputation and still be okay. So something like Tesla, where it's taken a reputational hit, it's still a really big business. The business is harmed, but they're not going out of business the way a small company would.
I'm curious if you're like an evil person in real life, or it's just like the online stereotype, like not evil, just like yeah, we'll go
No,
evil.
but I think he's like kind of ruthless. His Gecko, his Gordon Gecko, kind of side came out in what he was doing, although he hasn't said that.
Well, I actually can answer that because people love to think about that. There are people who know me and they know that I'm a very nice person, and I only do this kind of thing inside a game. So if you play a board game with me, you're going to have a bad time. But
Uh,
the other thing that I actually did was after I quit the game, I went to all of these players who were very, very upset with me about the way that I played the game, and I actually apologized to most of them and said, I'm sorry that this made the game not fun for you. I'm a high school student. I was trying to learn things, and almost all of them understood, and they were okay with it when I explained that what I was doing in this game was really just a game, and I was trying to explore different things you could do in the game. And I also really felt like I was playing a character, and I chose to play this character in a certain way. And I know a lot of people who've played something like Dungeons and Dragons will know very well that you have a character and you set this character to behave in a certain way, and that's how you decide to play the game. So it's it's really like that. I promise I'm a very nice person.
Just rip your throat out in an investment sense or a competitive sense.
Well, if you play a board game with me, you'll have a very bad time. I don't have much to say about boycotts in general, or even the boycott of my own guild, because what really happened is they told people not to buy from me, but then everyone had to question how much more am I willing to pay to avoid buying from this guy? And the answer was no one was willing to pay more to avoid me. I mean, that was basically the answer, because that hurts your status in the game. Effectively, if you are paying more money to buy things that you need to level up, that will make you level up slower. So you're not going to do it, because that was everybody's goal in the game, was to level up as fast as they possibly could, and anything that would make them slow down, they're not going to do. So when the guilds were telling their players not to buy from me, they just wouldn't listen. They just would ignore that.
So it wasn't much of an issue.
It wasn't much of an issue, but boycotts in the real world are a little more complicated, because usually it's something about this business is doing something in a way that we don't like. We're going to boycott them to get them to change their behavior. That can be successful, and that has been successful, but it's really challenging, because the first part is you need to convince a lot of people to participate, and it's hard to get a lot of people to agree on anything. And then you also have to sustain it. So even if you get a lot of people to participate, you have to get all of those people to participate over a long period of time. And over a period of time, they either just forget about it or they move on to another issue that is in the headlines more than what they're trying to boycott. So it's
Yeah.
not that boycotts never work or that they can't work. It's just very, very difficult to get a large enough people to participate, and to get them to participate for a long enough period of time for it to actually work.
Let me take it one step further on the rule breaking that you engaged in economics of online gaming. So you said that there was a secret that you kept for a long time after you quit the game, and the secret was that you were so well connected in the game as a guild that a person who was part of your guild, I think he quit to go work for the dev team,
Hmm.
um, started giving you special treatment inside the game itself. So the quote was that he was working on a secret mine. The mine would have everything that Rich needed to make iron and steel bars. No one else would be able to find it unless a rich member leaked its location. This mine would allow Rich to completely break the game. So it seems to me that what happened here is that your guild became so powerful in the context of Eternal Lands that you kind of co-opted the development team itself and started getting more advantages than any other guild would have. I think you're right that it did break the game. And I guess the question for you is, in that game context and in real life, when any company is allowed to, any guild, any manufacturer, whatever it is allowed to break the rules of the game the way that you did it, isn't that the end of competition? Doesn't it destroy the concept of a market?
Well, the short answer is yes. It absolutely does. That's I I can give a little more context on the story behind how this thing with the development team happened too. So I had so since this was such a small game and it was really one developer, he would take people who played the game to help him develop the game, which I thought was really smart because he would get free labor that way. But the problem was when you have developers who are also playing the game, there's this temptation to add things that are special benefits just for their own team or their own players. And anybody who joined the development team was required to promise that they wouldn't do that. And I had this guy in my guild. He was required to leave my guild, which most people were not required to leave their guild, but he was required to leave my guild because of the reputation that my guild had. The other people on the development team said, "We don't want anybody in his guild on the development team. If you're going to join us, you have to leave." So he left, and then he sent me a message and he said, "Hey, guess what I'm working on? I'm doing this just for Rich." And what it was basically a secret cave that had everything you needed to do to produce. And most of the time, you would have to walk like halfway across the map, gather materials, carry it back. But this you could do all in one spot. And it wasn't necessarily secret or illegal in any way because the other developers knew that it was being created too. But what the idea was, I think, I don't know all the specifics, but I think the idea was a player should stumble on this secret instead of already knowing about it beforehand. So knowing about it beforehand was really what the advantage was. And it was absolutely, entirely, totally unfair. There's no other way to put it. And I actually think I quit the game shortly after that because I felt like I beat the game at that point. That's the ultimate. You beat the MMO. If you get one of your players on the development team, you have beat the MMO. I don't think there's any other way to actually beat an MMO, but that was pretty much what I would say. And it does completely destroy competition because this was a guild that already had a structural advantage from this was a guild that already had a structural advantage from producing. You give that structural advantage another unfair structural advantage, and then the game is basically over.
When you won that programmer over, it was, quote, a pure example of regulatory capture. And in the book, you talk about how the FCC in 2017 had a real world example, in your view, of regulatory capture because they repealed some network neutrality stuff. And the guy was like a Verizon lawyer, I believe. And in our email exchange, you also talked about Elon Musk's Doge being an example of regulatory capture during the second, Trump administration. And I can't help but think about the consequences beyond the game world, right? This is again a crossover parallel thing here, that regulatory capture in that sense, when you start being able to mess with the rules of the game of competition in a way no one else can, you kind of set yourself up to be, if you're not already a monopolist, you're kind of like an unbeatable vendor. And in that case, again, you've broken competition. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on regulatory capture, but that was kind of the gist of it.
Well, I wrote my master's paper on network neutrality, so I should have some thoughts on it. So effectively, what it means is it creates an inefficiency that shouldn't exist, and then someone profits from that inefficiency. So it's using the system to create an inefficiency, and then you place someone in that spot and they profit from it. That's effectively what regulatory capture is doing.
You said you wrote that the secret rich mind crossed the line from capitalism to corruption. And I guess my thought there was that there are illicit mods and cheatware used in World of Warcraft, CS2, COD, GTA 5, Fortnite, you know, and in a way your mind was like an embedded illegal mod. And so you manipulated rules of the game again. And I wonder if I know you quit the game shortly thereafter, but do you feel any guilt or remorse about potentially destroying the game, right? Because at the end of it, you kind of ran it. You did break the game, you did win the game, but the consequence, at least around that same time, coincidentally, if not causality, was that the game basically failed. It's still around. If you go to eternal-lands.com, you can literally go play it today, but there's very little activity in any of the message boards. So I guess my question is, my sense is that you at a minimum contributed to the downfall of the game, partly because the regulator was asleep at the switch. He let you do what you did. And I'm wondering if that is an unfair representation of the, I hate to do a spoiler alert on your book, the climax of the book, but that was the spoiler alert that I took away.
I, it's funny because no one's ever asked me that question before. No one's ever asked me if I felt bad about it, and I guess everyone just assumes that I didn't, and I didn't feel bad about it. I was a high school kid, and I was exploring the boundaries of what you could do in a game like this, and I never thought of it as an illegal part of the game. But I have had people just say, "Hey, did you realize that that's considered cheating?" Which I hadn't thought of either. And I think part of it was when I played the game, I was playing as what I thought this character would do. So when I was making these decisions and I would run it through my head, okay, this person is the villain. This is how they've done things up to this point. How would someone in this mindset make that decision? But no, I never felt bad about the way that I played the game, but I did at some point decide that there were people who weren't having fun and I should at least apologize to them for taking away their fun.
That was just a snippet of our interview and podcast with Andrew Wagner and Lewis Ward. It is such a cool experience. I can't tell you how this one was just so much fun to listen to because you get to hear how someone just as a kid wanted to game the system and see what they can do and how they can break something. And if you want to learn more about Andrew, you can check him out at playerdriven.io. We'll have information there. If you got anything out of this, please like it, share it, subscribe. It really helps the channel in a huge way. We appreciate every one of you. And let us know, have you ever played a game and felt like you were getting conned in the market or anything? We appreciate you listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.